So one of the first things I wanted to do today was just show you some stuff that I've got that's partially done and just kind of get an idea of what we're trying to accomplish with what we're doing. This is just a little Here Comes the Sun, and I made several at one point recently that I didn't want to have a lot of color, and so this was one. I'll put a tree on here. You can see the kinds of shapes that I habitually like to do on this series. This is a horse that is in process, and my husband likes this horse. I don't know what's going on with this snout. You know, the horse is elusive in some ways, and so I'm doing my best with that, but I'm just not sure. And I like to have a little bit of fun with the background here. You know, with the swirls, I like to do something that'll show up, but then I think it's fun to include the dragonfly fabric in there, in that part of the background. This was going to be a big piece, and then I cut it in half and decided it would be 2 panels for like a diptych. I'm not sure if I'm going to finish it that way, but this is the piece actually that I was working on when I kept having so much trouble doing what I was planning to do in the stitching itself that I stopped quilting for a while and started trying to look seriously at why I was getting so fumble fingered. But this one, I really like some of the parts. I think even though a little bit of it is sloppier than I would have liked, I really like some of this. It's just a little different, and I'm really liking some of this stuff going on in this sky. So this is a piece that hasn't been basted yet, and it's supposed to be sort of an abstract with just sort of areas of color of this nice warm gold fabric, or these nice fabrics, and then the blue, which I wanted it to sort of evoke beach and water, sand and water. This is the piece that I'm going to stitch on today. And it's a really good idea to keep a little scrap of a sandwich nearby that you can test sew on to test your tension, because you want to have all of your tension at least decent. I always use a neutral, one color of neutral thread in the back of my wall hangings, but in the beginning I always matched to my top thread, and so I tend, if there's any of that back bobbin thread showing, I want to change my tension. I want to make sure I didn't make it too loose on the back. I'm okay with that. A little bit of black is showing, which is alright. I do like my stitches to be a little more distinct here, so I'm going to even go a little more. Zigzags are one of the hardest places to have your stitching look good because of the sharp change in direction. Some people like to free motion quilt with their feed dogs actually down. Some people prefer not to. I go both ways. It kind of depends on what I'm doing, and I often change after I notice that things don't look quite the way I want. This is the way I'm doing it is going to make a little bit of a black build up when I switch direction, but I like the rest of my stitch quality, and so I'm okay with that. And so I'm going to leave the machine the way that it is. I actually got a little bit of water on this end of this piece at my iron, and so the wash away dissolved, but I'm just going to flatten everything out to where it goes. And I normally would just pull it off a little bit out of my way, but I'm going to put this in here, and I don't want this top line to just be a line. I want it actually to have quite a bit of movement in that top line along there. So I'm going to be making sure I add that. And I did plant this green all the way underneath, and so I'm not sure what I'm going to do here. I usually decide on the fly. Sometimes I wake up knowing how I'm going to quilt something, but I want something to cut. I don't want to just have a straight line, although I certainly have done that plenty of times. Try to have a little movement in this front. So I think I might do different shapes that might look sort of like grasses in the foreground, flowers, bushes, I don't know. We'll see what we think it looks like. I do know that with time your stitch kind of settles into the fabric, and with the washing it kind of evens out. But really, really bad tension is just going to be really, really bad tension. So you want to avoid that. One thing that I do a lot of is try to have a very contrasty stitching on my pieces. So I'm going to stitch over this very patterned fabric, this batik, with black, and hope that that shows up quite a bit. I do have sort of a protocol when I work on these. It's not something that I ever planned or made decisions about so much as just paying attention to how the materials behave and what allowed me to end up with the flattest piece. Because of the washing, these pieces aren't super flat and they're a little stretchy in a sense, and they're not as flat as they would be if you didn't wash them at all, but they have a very nice texture and a lot of depth and visual interest in the stitching because of the fact that you wash and shrink all the layers together. And so when I'm making one of these, I try to start at the bottom and I anchor a wide strip across the bottom, which I usually consider the foreground. I often do more than one fabric for that, and in this case I'm for sure going to do at least two of the fabrics that I have in the foreground. And I then do the top areas in the sky, and I will stitch on 2 or 3 fabrics in the sky and try to add a lot of interest up there while I'm doing that. And then I like to work in the center and do some areas. With this piece I'll do the mountains because it's very important to me that the skyline above the mountains be the way that I want it. I won't necessarily stitch the bottom of the mountains completely. I might plan to have the foreground sort of overlap the mountains. Okay, so I'm going to do this green, and I'm going to do it with yellow thread. I want it to show up. I am just using all-purpose thread for this stitching. I used to use only cotton to stitch the quilts, and there are a lot of considerations for that sort of thing. I'll stitch really anything into a quilt. I've used yarn and done that in the bobbin with bobbin drawing. I've used metallics in ways they weren't necessarily intended to be used. I've used variegated serger thread. I've used various rayon threads that have kind of a nice sheen. What I don't like to use is the clear thread because it's easy to melt that with your iron, and I don't want to melt away my stitching, and that always seems to end up in places like near your binding where it's pretty important that it stay in there, so I would rather use a cotton or a cotton poly thread in those locations. I am careful with the metallics that I use and the rayon thread and that sort of thing, that I don't apply a ton of heat, but those are usually used decoratively in a particular area, and so it's not that type of thing where you're just trying to press your binding and you realize you've pressed out your stitching, which I had happen in the beginning when I was using the clear thread to stitch around, you know, in the ditch next to a binding. Okay, so I am going to trim all this out and see how it looks. Okay, so I pulled out my thread here so you can really see. This is the setup I have. This going across here, and this piece coming across here. And I want to be aware of where this is, so I'm going to mark that as well. But then I'm just going to flip it out of my way. Because I think I want those mountains to kind of come up here. I'm not sure. I think my fabric is sort of oddly shaped for my back mountains. But I'm going to work with what I've got instead of trying to change it a bunch. And I might want this, what I'm doing here, to go down a little bit behind those mountains, but not very much. So that's why I marked that. So I'm just going to get this nice and smooth. I find myself struggling with how to simplify these instructions enough so that someone who's watched the videos before that explain some of what we're doing here, who's motivated to really try this, can follow along and do it, but keep the work as complex as I would do it normally. And one of the things that I'm struggling with is trying to explain that this isn't a linear process the way some sewing projects are. This is very intuitive. It requires you to trust yourself. It requires you to make that leap and just try something and trust that you'll figure something out if you don't like it at first, if you feel a little lost. If you actually do a project like this and you've never done one like it before, you're going to feel lost. And in that case, I do recommend that you try the little one that I'm posting on my website along with this. That will be much easier to just take on and do it and sort of see the big picture of how it all comes together, and then work on this where you've got so many layers and you're trying to make things look so much more complicated and also be so much bigger. What I'm doing now is not something I've done a lot, this particular stitching, but the process I've done a lot. I'm seeing opportunities here and I'm going to do them, and I don't know how to teach the thing that happens with me where I see the potential in what's happening and I imagine it and I see it and then I try to create it. And if that doesn't happen for you, you'll need to find a substitute, some other thing to help spark your imagination while you're creating. But for me, what I see with this is, instead of cutting out this part where there's just batting behind it, I'm going to stitch in there with yellow variegated thread and in there, and then around here I see this sort of sky taking place in my mind's eye, and so I'm trying to make it happen now in fabric. And like I say, if you don't see imaginatively like that, I think there are things you can do, but I think we all are creative in different ways, and so certainly there must be something that feeds your creativity and helps you find the next thing to do that you can get excited about and that can help you to express yourself. And boy, if these videos are helping you with that a little bit, that's awesome. The idea of that makes me really happy. So I've probably shown this before. I like to mark stuff I don't like that much that I've done with chalk, so that like I'm gonna probably have a tree over this. I don't know if I'll have anything over here, but if I do, I can cover that. So here's what I have so far, and you can see that I have some nice movement and interest in here, and I have this nice green area, and got more green foreground to deal with, and then I've got my mountains and my purple mountains behind, and then a little bit of sky left that I haven't done anything with. It's a nice fall evening, a little breezy. And also blah bitty blue blah, red and yellow. Oops.